Some people are getting really bored with the sound of modern worship drumming. So maybe it's time we went back to something old to get something new. Maybe it's time we went back to the 80s. Because everything comes around in circles eventually. Back to the 80s is a trend at the moment. Think of John Mayer's music. So here are 5 tips about how to get the 80s worship drum sound. So tip number 1 to get that retro drum sound. Here's an example of it. To pull off this tip, ideally you'd need a drum kit with many, many toms in a row. It sounds like this. This tip is all about the kind of drum fills that you play. Here's another old school classic drum fill. To be fair, that drum fill's pretty epic. But this tip is all about getting big, cheesy drum fills, rolling along the toms, or rototoms if you have them. Because modern worship is all about those simple, atmospheric building fills, like this. The old school fills are big and they're cheesy. Here's tip number 2. In modern worship, they use a lot of big, beefy drum sounds, especially on the snare drum. But listen to what they did back in the 80s.
My Jesus, my Savior.
To get the 80s worship drum sound, you've got to use some cross stick on the snare drum early on in the song, like this. And once you've got that down, you'll want to turn it down. Because in modern worship, the drums are really loud to help people keep time and to build oomph. But not so in the 80s. It seems like the drums were really quiet in the mix. So tip number 2 to get the 80s worship drum sound is use some cross stick and turn the drums down. Okay, here's tip number 3. Listen out for it on this classic track. So it's quite different to the modern worship drum sound, isn't it? Modern worship is all about the lyrics being heard and the music mostly getting out of the way. But 80s worship is all about having those hits and those stabs. Like, this drum kit doesn't even work. So you can get that retro drum sound by doing more hits and stabs. Here's tip number 4. When they re-record old worship songs nowadays, do you ever notice what the difference is? Have a listen to these 2 songs and notice the differences.
Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open my eyes of my heart. I want to see you. Our prayer, God. I want to see you. Open my eyes to see you high and lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. Pour out your power and love as we sing holy, holy, holy.
In modern worship, the drummer will often hit the toms to stay out of the way of the vocals and occupy a different frequency space. But not so in the 80s. They were hitting the cymbals like this. Whereas nowadays, we play something like this. So to get the 80s worship drum sound, instead of hitting the toms, make sure you cram a load of high end in by hitting the cymbals lots. Here's tip number 5. What do you do when you want to finish a song? You could just hit the 1 chord and let it ring out, or you could end with singing in a cappella with the whole church. But that's not what old school worship did. Have a listen to see what they did. Now you might think that's not possible in real life, but that's where you're wrong. With an electric drum kit, that's where you can do that. Maybe this is the only benefit of having an electric drum kit. So one of the things that I find defines retro and 80s worship music is fading out at the end of the song. A more realistic thing to do is slow down at the end of the song, like this. All this kind of drumming was popular back in the 80s, but trends come and go, and it can be dizzying and discouraging to try and keep up with them. What people like changes, but the good news is, God never changes. Hebrews 13 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. whatever type of drumming you use, keep worshipping him. In this video, I've talked a lot about the 80s worship drum sound, but I've also mentioned the modern worship drum sound. If you want to learn about the modern worship drum sound, then you can watch this video that I made next. That's only if you want to get that sound. Some people in the comments of that video were thinking I was saying you had to do that kind of drumming. That's not the case. I'm saying play the drums to help your church worship Jesus.